He lived in the upper rooms of a whitewashed house in one of the oldest streets flanking the Rock of Gibraltar. He was known in the town as a jobbing carpenter. Apparently, he'd been mustered out of the Royal Navy due to a shoulder injury and had taken up a trade on home turf. She was willing to bet he was working on behalf of her father-in-law, no doubt through someone else, but she couldn't be sure. In all likelihood, he would not know who, along the chain of communicants, had assigned his remit. There were those, she knew, who would not understand or sympathize with her decision to adopt her maiden name once again, but there was comfort in hearing herself say Maisie Dobbs. Her surname carried a sense of belonging, now that James was gone. It had her father's down-to-earth roots in its very sound, reminding her of the way even his footfall seemed grounded with meaning. It was as if the name was stamped on her very being, like a brand. Her father was the most stalwart person she'd ever known, perhaps even more so than her late mentor, the famed forensic scientist and psychologist, Dr. Maurice Blanche. And as much as she knew her deceased husband's parents loved her, she didn't feel as if she were a Compton. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried again to banish the images from her mind, images that came to her often and unbidden, with no warning of their imminent arrival. There it was again, the aircraft gaining speed, swooping low across the escarpment. Once more the memory was so strong that she might have been swept back in time to the day John Otterburn's cadre of engineers, designers, and a selected aviator were due to test a new weapon on board the aircraft. James was not meant to be flying. He was to be making notes, having discussions on the ground, and peering into the sky through his binoculars. She was sitting on a rocking chair on the wraparound porch of the old farmhouse, used as headquarters for the engineers and aviators, where lunch had been laid out. One hand rested on her rounded belly, while the other shielded her eyes from the sun. John Otterburn had come back to the house twice to see if his indulged daughter, indulged as far as Maisie was concerned, had arrived for the flight. Elaine Otterburn had claimed the piloting of this particular test for herself, arguing that a woman with her expertise could handle the craft just as well as a man. Otterburn had cursed when Maisie informed him that Elaine had yet to appear, then left to walk back to the other men, clustered alongside the landing strip. Maisie stood up as she watched James meet Otterburn, still shielding her eyes with one hand. The two small figures in the distance appeared to be in some discussion. She left the farmhouse and began to walk across the field toward her husband and the man he'd agreed to help in his quest to provide a new fighter aircraft to support Britain's air defence should war come once more. They had waited and waited at the airfield, a most secret airfield on Otterburn land, and still there was no sign of Elaine. Then, as Maisie reached the men, a messenger came along on a motorcycle. He brought a note from Otterburn's wife, informing her husband that Elaine had been to a party the night before and couldn't even construct a sentence that morning, let alone fly. She was spending the day in her bed, sleeping off too many champagne cocktails. Maisie remembered thinking that only this spoilt young woman could have found a party in such a rural area. Then James offered to fly the test. Just one flight, just one test, a takeoff and landing, and in between a burst of gunfire to make sure everything worked, after which he would report on the aircraft's stability, the effect the gun had on trim when firing, and how changes in weapon emplacement affected handling. Once again, James was stepping forward in the service of his country. The thought crossed Maisie's mind, though, as she watched her husband don the padded overalls and his sheepskin aviator's jacket, then pull a leather balaclava over his head, that if push came to shove, his country would know nothing of his work. On behalf of his friends in high places, Otterburn would deny that James Compton had been anything more than an enthusiastic aviation hobbyist. She regretted ever having had that thought, but James had gone back on his word that morning. He'd promised her he would not fly, not now, with a child on the way. He'd given her his promise that from now on he would only ever be an observer, working in an advisory capacity.